Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Astro Bloom Podcast. My name is Vanya Banks, and I'm your host. Today, I'm joined by my friend Jeff Sorensen from Breath Army. Welcome, Jeff. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Vanya. I'm excited to dive in and chat.
Yeah, I'm super excited to have you share your wisdom, a little bit about your story, your background, and how you found the healing power of breath, and how you share that with others in your work. So yeah, tell us a little bit about yourself. Maybe starting with your big three in astrology and your human design, and yeah, we'll dive into your work and how you use breath to help others heal.
Amazing. Yeah. Well, my big three, I have a Libra sun and an Aries moon and an Aries rising. And my human design, I am a 5/1 heretic investigator.
And what's your energy type?
Um, Sacral? Is that? I don't know.
No, sacral is your authority probably, but the like manifester,
Oh,
manigen,
yeah, I'm a generator.
generator. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a 5/2 actually, so it's
Oh,
interesting to look at
interesting.
that five line. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's
Heretic.
a lot of
That's
five
fun.
lines in my
Oh,
life, I find. We're sort of
yeah,
the problem solvers.
it's an interesting one for sure.
Mhm.
Bringing forward information that oftentimes people may not feel like they're ready to hear.
Totally. Yeah. And I think simultaneously, a lot of people kind of seek answers from you without like
Mhm.
really being conscious of that too. So yeah, it is an interesting energy to live in. And I also feel like, I've taken a brief look at your chart as well. And we've talked about, that polarity between like the self and the other and relationships being a huge part of what you do. But it's also interesting, we just kind of were prepping for this episode talking about air and fire. And you've got a lot of that in your chart. So, I mean, I think it's always interesting to see what people kind of do in their life, what their purpose is, and then the sort of the elemental composition of their chart. Yours obviously being moving air, right? So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it really does. It's fascinating to learn more, as we go through our lives and start to make those correlations and see how it's playing out in our life.
Yeah, and being someone obviously who works very individually and collectively with people too, like there's such a highlight of that axis of Libra and Aries, I think, in from what I see anyway, in how you show up in the world. So it's always cool to see it in action.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I'd love to know a little bit more about, I know this is probably going to be a big question, but sort of like how did you find breath work? And maybe giving us a little bit of a background on like the breadcrumbs that led you there.
hmm Yeah. Well, I was born here in Revelstoke, BC, where we both are right now. And almost 20 years ago, I left. And that was after a bunch of near-death experiences and in the midst of hardcore drug addiction. And at that point in my life, I knew that I needed to get as far away from Revelstoke as I could. And so that was a windy path that led down to Mazatlan in Mexico. And when I got to Mazatlan, I was still deep in addiction. And a couple of months after I got there, I found yoga, or sometimes I like to say that yoga found me.
Yeah.
And so very quickly, I gave up my addictions and I dove into yoga and got introduced to the movement aspect of yoga as well as meditation and pranayama. And I was hooked on that. And that really became my new addiction. And shortly after I started practicing, I started teaching and was a really, really dedicated, devoted student. It had been such an incredible lifeline. And I think at that point in my life, I really recognized that I really needed to dedicate myself to that and to really stay with it for a time until I kind of got my feet back on the ground. And so I taught and practiced through those years and lived in Mazatlan. And eventually, there's kind of a long story in between, but I ended up back in Canada about 12 years ago. And at that time, I had stepped away from teaching for a while and was really kind of trying to feel into how to how to express in that world of facilitating and teaching. And it felt like there was something more to be uncovered beyond the kind of the traditional yoga and pranayama. And along the way, I got really interested in breathwork. And that had been a part of some of the teacher trainings that I had done. And the Wim Hof method came into my field. And, at that time I was doing fairly well, and I was functioning well in the world. And yet I was still really struggling with health issues. And, I was finding that I wasn't feeling the confidence that I needed to really bring what I wanted to the world. And when I got into what I would call big breathing now, and doing that on a regular basis and getting in the cold water, that was really like flipping a switch for me, and being able to conquer that fear of getting in the icy water every day really switched something within me and allowed me to move forward with the things that I really wanted to do in life. And I was working as a paramedic at that time. And so I've always had a really keen interest in the human body and the biology of the body and chemistry of the body, and came from a really scientific background. And so I was working as a paramedic, and of course breath is a huge part of that, and being able to see people in distress and at points in their lives where breath is life, and really recognizing the profundity of that, along with my interest in exploring that as a modality, led me to decide that I wanted to learn absolutely everything I could about the breath. And even when I had been in my yoga journey very early, I'd been able to discern that my breath was a huge piece, and the dysregulation that had taken me on the road that I had been on, and started to see how much it had been disrupted by the traumas in my life. And so when I went down that path, I was really fortunate to study with some really great teachers, and it was an interesting point in breathwork because it was really just coming into its own as a modality and coming into the mainstream. And it felt like there was a big opportunity at that point to bridge some of the different modalities and to really start to see how those practices could be utilized in the day-to-day and kind of the real-time unfolding of life. And it seemed to me that there was a huge kind of missed opportunity within the practice of breath work. And it seemed kind of like with meditation and with yoga that in the West, we'd kind of dissociated those practices from applying them in the real world. And so, it's kind of like this idea of going to a yoga class. So I'm going to do yoga, I'm going to meditate. But really, all of these things are meant to be integrated into our lives. Yeah. And so I spent a lot of time and energy really trying to weave together the different modalities and try and figure out how to apply that to people healing in real time and working through the traumas, through the triggers that were presenting in the moment-to-moment unfolding of life. And so that's where Breath Army was born. And really I've been kind of trying to figure out, what that actually means and how that actually wants to express in the world. And I feel like I'm still in that journey and learning lots myself. And, I think we're in such a fascinating time right now where we're really coming back to this internal wisdom. And I think that the breath and the body are integral parts in that, and developing those relationships are really key to allowing us to evolve into this higher expression that we're being called forward to.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. That's very well put. I think there's so many threads in that I want to go down. One just kind of, I guess, more basic one. You and I maybe both know the kind of the answer to this question, but just for listeners that are unfamiliar with the term pranayama, do you maybe describe the difference, if there is one, between pranayama and like the type of breath work that you're doing?
Well, pranayama is a part of the breath work that I offer, and it's the traditional yogic practice of manipulating the breath or coming into relationship with the breath. and utilizing it in different ways to either burn through the blockages in the body or create altered states of consciousness. And so breathwork in the world, kind of as it's known as a modality, includes different techniques that I would say have been around for a long time, but maybe weren't emphasized as much as they have been individually over the last 60 or 80 years. And so in the mid 1900s, different people brought forward these techniques that I would call big breathing, things like holotropic breathwork and conscious connected breathing, and started really recognizing the benefit of creating these altered states of consciousness and the healing potential that was available within those states. And so that started to become a modality on its own. But like I said before, what I saw when I kind of came into the breathwork world was that all of these things were very separate. And so there were these big breathing modalities, and then there was pranayama, and then there was like a whole nother arm of functional breathing. And it seemed like none of these were connected in any way. But for me, kind of coming in and looking at it with fresh eyes, it seemed very odd to me that there was no interweaving of the modalities or recognition of the similarities within all of them. And to me, that felt really foundational in sharing with people, and also being able, again, to extract the pieces from these practices that people were engaging in. So like a pranayama session or a breathwork session, it's like, well, how does that really apply to day-to-day life? Yeah. And of course, we're breathing all day long, every day. And the fascinating thing about breath is that most of the time, for most people, it's an unconscious activity. Mm-hmm. And yet the breath is a gateway into the nervous system because it's something that we can also consciously control. Mm-hmm. And so it's a good thing that we're breathing all the time, because if we didn't breathe, we would die. And yet every single trauma and unprocessed experience in our life manifests itself in the way that we receive the breath and let it go in that constant process. And so that process, which is ideally a very natural process, becomes very dysregulated. And so the breath is integral in balancing the pH within the body, creating energy within the body, and really at its essence is the way that we receive and process life. And so when it becomes dysregulated, it dysregulates the pH within the body. And so that affects every single cellular process that's going on in the body, because pH is something that is very strictly regulated within the body. And it also affects the way that we are receiving life, the way that we're interacting with life, because of course the breath is the interface between our perception of our internal world and the external world. So like the breath is this bridge in between. And so we start to control and manipulate the breath in ways that help us cope with traumatic experiences. And yet when those become chronic, then that starts to really dysregulate the chemistry of our body, can create a myriad of health conditions, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual. And so when we can really uncover all of those and start to see those relationships, then we start to uncover the incredible potential within paying more attention to our breath, and the incredible power within us that can unlock when we start to let go of some of those dysfunctional patterns in our breathing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess what I'm hearing is that the breath is really this anchor, right? Like I think that's a cue we often use in vinyasa type yoga, right? Of like using the breath as an anchor into the present moment. And so I think it's a really powerful way to, like anchor ourselves into the here, into the now, into our bodies, right? So in a way, what you were also saying is, this need to integrate these practices into our daily life. And I think that's so relevant also to the current astrology with the new lunar nodes currently being in Virgo and Pisces. It's all about like taking the spiritual Pisces, the divine, all of these things, and integrating it into our daily life through rituals, through practices. And what better way to do that than the breath, right? Something that's with us literally every second of every day, and using that to anchor ourselves into more awareness, and into being in our bodies and grounding ourselves in our bodies, right? So yeah, I just wanted to draw that link there too, because I think it's particularly a useful piece of wisdom anytime, but especially right now.
Absolutely. Yeah, it feels like more and more so it's becoming important to be able to have these tools that we really recognize are a part of our being, that we're resourcing in order to create that presence and that ability to meet life through that active presence, and to be able to recognize the patterns that we're showing up with, and to be able to have a tool that can help to just create a little bit of space in that process and allow us to unwind the patterns that are holding us back from that full expression in life.
Yeah, totally. Now, you also talked about, this, obviously the breath's effect on the nervous system and it being kind of the gateway into the nervous system. One thing that I'm particularly interested in, and work a lot in the realm of with my clients and in my work, is sort of inner child healing, processing, traumas, specifically when we think about like certain emotional triggers that we store, in our nervous system of, painful past experiences, whether those are things that happened to us that shouldn't have happened to us, things that should have happened to us, didn't happen to us, right? And so I wonder if you can speak a little bit, like even just from that scientific perspective, using your understanding of the breath and the body and trauma, and maybe speak to how the breath can be used to process traumas and to heal from that perspective. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does. I think I might even take it one step back and speak to how the breath becomes dysregulated in those
Okay. Yeah.
experiences and how that ties into the nervous system. And so if we have a traumatic experience that feels too much to process in that moment, then we try and establish some sense of control within that experience. And so oftentimes we will start to restrict our breathing in a way that makes us feel like we've got some kind of an anchor to hold on to, and some way to be able to navigate our way through that experience. And that's virtually always going on unconsciously. And so we start to control the way that we're breathing, and we start to manipulate the breath in different ways. And if anybody has ever taken part in a pranayama practice or a big breathing experience, something like a conscious connected breath session, people have an idea of how powerful that tool is to create these altered states of consciousness. And we do that same thing in traumatic experiences, is we'll create an altered state of consciousness in order to be able to cope and to be able to get through this really traumatic experience that we're having. And yet, just like any other substance that would create an altered state of consciousness, when we're utilizing that on a regular basis, and again, this is unconscious, then that starts to dysregulate and become something that is affecting our life in a way that generally is not in service to us being fully present, because it was established in a time where we were oftentimes dissociating from what was actually happening because it was too traumatic. And so it kind of becomes this default unconscious coping mechanism that becomes integrated into our breathing in, breathing out that we do 20,000 times a day. And anytime that we are exposed to something that is triggering or traumatic, then we'll default back to that patterning. And we'll use that same tool to create these same dissociative states so that we're not having to look at these challenging and difficult experiences, emotions. And that just kind of becomes our default. And so the breath and the nervous system are intricately intertwined. You can't separate them because one affects the other. The nervous system affects the breath affects our nervous system. And so that's constantly creating these changes in the nervous system and how we feel in our bodies. And so it's either expressing this more fight or flight side of the nervous system and creating states of anxiety through a shallow, rapid breath, or creating dissociative states by really restricting the breath and getting really, really small and kind of pretending like we're not here. And so those patterns start to show up everywhere in our lives. And so for me, the goal has been in working with people to start to bring more awareness to this process that's occurring all day, every day, and to bring more awareness to the state of the nervous system in our body. And so when we can start to read that state and start to read the different states of regulation and dysregulation, then we can start to see how the two are correlated. And when I'm feeling anxious, for example, I notice that my breath is changing and oftentimes becoming much more rapid, oftentimes increasing in volume. And so we can start to see and we can start to learn, well, what is a functional breath? And I like to think about it in terms of a relationship. And so we hear a lot about controlling the breath. And oftentimes, even the word pranayama is defined or translated as control of the breath. But really, if we go deeper than that, it means developing and establishing a relationship with the breath. And so anytime we try and control something, there's generally a counter effect of some kind of rebellion. Mm-hmm. And so our body is the same way. If we're trying to control the body, if we're trying to control the breath, if we're trying to control the nervous system, then it expresses more of what we actually don't want. And so if we can start to develop that relationship with the body, develop a relationship with what we're feeling in our body, develop a relationship with the breath, then we can start to notice these different states arise and we can start to embrace them. It's like, okay, I'm having this experience of anxiety right now. I can see what's happening with my breath. And I'm also recognizing that I'm not a victim to that actually I have agency, and that the gateway to being able to exercise that agency is by utilizing both my awareness of my body, how I'm positioned, how I'm posturing within my body, where I'm holding tension in my body, orienting to the present moment, which of course involves the breath, and creating that connection, establishing that relationship with the breath, and then guiding it back towards a more regulated state and being able to just kind of slowly unwind the activation that we're feeling within the body. Or if it's on the other side of the spectrum, starting to bring ourselves out of those dissociative states and bring ourselves back into the present moment, which is the only moment where we actually have agency. And so then we can really create this little bit of space so that we can meet those triggers and we can meet those emotions voluntarily, and then start to change the outcome of our life and get out of these patterns of behavior that keep repeating. And so I have a belief that we are all expressions of life and that life is self-healing. And so if we've had a traumatic experience, then life will keep presenting similar traumatic experiences in order to heal and to work through them. But until we recognize that, then we're just locked in this cycle of repeating patterns. And so we need something to interrupt that cycle, mm-hmm. and to be able to create the awareness to start to unravel them and meet them in new ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very well put. I mean, I think, once something is conscious, right? It's like once you bring something into your awareness, it's really hard to continue to look away. Because I think then you either have to enter that like victimhood cycle of like, oh, this is happening to me, right? And kind of just look the other way, or you have to empower yourself to do something differently. And I think, the breath is such a powerful tool to bring that sense of awareness into those present moments. And I think also as someone who's, who uses various embodiment practices to help people find regulation when they are feeling triggered in that hyper or hypoactive state, I think the breath is particularly is really useful when we're in that hypo state of potentially being like more immobilized or shut down in our response, where it might actually be difficult to like move the body to shake it out, right? To get rid of that excess tension. It's, I feel like the breath can be a very simple and effective tool to bring awareness and to, like you said, to not exert control over the the nervous system, but to bring awareness to what's happening and to develop that relationship to it. And I think it's interesting that that word control as well, because it does give the impression of like hierarchy, right? When I'm controlling something, it's like I am above it. And I like the way that you put it as more of a relationship, right? There's an exchange there of information coming in and going out. But it's a really still empowering way, I think, to look at it. So I like that analogy that you used, and encouraging more of a relationship versus more of like a control dynamic. Are you interested in unlocking the full expression of your authentic self through plants and planets? Go to astrobloom.ca and use the code AstroBloomPod to save 10% off of your astrology reading.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think it's really important. I think in the West, we have this way of reducing things. And so the breath has kind of been reduced to this physiological process that keeps us alive. Mm-hmm. And yet, from my perspective, the breath is life. The breath is consciousness. And so without breath, there is no life, there is no consciousness. And so if we define breath more in that way, which is how it's traditionally been defined by all cultures around the world, there's this recognition of its intrinsic relationship and expression of life, then we can think about our relationship with our breath as to being analogous to our relationship with life. And so the way that we're breathing is the way that we're living. And so when we start to unwind the patterns that are wound up within our breath, then we can start to flow more with life, and we can allow life to express through us. And we can regain that sense of trust to be able to receive life, to be able to let it go and to let it flow through us. And I think that's a really beautiful thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the theme of like surrender as well is so important, I think, all the time, but especially right now as we're in this very transformative year with a lot of outer planets, particularly changing signs. Yeah, I think the theme of like being able to surrender and to like let life flow and let things proceed the way they're going to, even though sometimes we might not be understanding of why things are happening a certain way. Yeah, I think that's really important, and it's important to have tools that bring us into that state of surrender, because I think that's something I'm constantly learning in my life. I think all of us are, but particularly speaking for myself, being someone with a Virgo sun and a Pisces moon, it's this constant balance between control and surrender, right? Needing to know everything and then just letting things flow and happen the way the divine wants them to. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think, we can even circle it back to what you were speaking about earlier around the breath being an anchor. And within these times of great transition, that we really need something to hold on to that, that feels safe and where we can feel like things are okay. And I think, we can reach to things externally, to try and gain that sense of safety. And yet increasingly those ways that we've traditionally kind of anchored ourselves are dissolving, and they're not really working because we need to come back to our own bodies. And so to be able to develop a relationship with the breath, be able to develop that relationship with the nervous system, to be able to anchor ourselves and create safety within our own bodies. I always like to say that, nobody or no thing can actually create a sense of safety for us, that we develop a sense of safety from within. And so I think right now, more than ever, or certainly more than in any other point in modern history, that's becoming a more and more important ability to cultivate.
Yeah, totally. You mentioned moving, from Mexico back to Canada and delving into the world of, the like hot or the cold exposure and like Wim Hof and all these things. It sounds like that was, that was kind of necessary to take you from the warm waters of Mexico to back to Canada to delve into that world. But could you maybe touch on that a little bit? I know it's become such a popular thing, cold exposure, hot cold exposure for like nervous system regulation and all of these things. Could you touch a little bit on that and sort of your experience with it and maybe why it was so profound for yourself and for others that you assist on their journeys?
I would love to talk about that. Yeah, I think the cold has been such a powerful teacher for me. And I think, we refer to the cold as a hormetic stressor, which is a type of stress that in small doses can make us stronger, but in large doses could kill us. And I think the cold is potentially one of the greatest hormetic stressors that we can use in our lives. And so for me, it initially really helped me to be able to meet my fears in a different way, because I hated the cold. I hated cold water. I was cold all the time. And my relationship with the cold was one that was very disempowering, because life in Canada, the cold is part of life. And I would say more broadly that the cold is an aspect of life that many of us try to deny and push away, kind of label as something that's bad. We've created all of these cultural stories around what cold means, how it's dangerous. And so we adopt a lot of these stories that are passed on from generation to generation, and oftentimes maybe very rightfully so, because at some point in our family history, in our ancestral line, people have probably died from cold exposure. Mm-hmm. And yet, if we're able to use it in a conscious way, we hear a lot in the world, and I've been watching as cold exposure as well has become this thing and its own modality, and it is very popular. And yet, what seems to be the real focus for a lot of people is the physical benefits. It's like, okay, if I get in the cold for 3 minutes a day, then I'm going to get all this benefit to my immune system and inflammation in my body, and I'm going to feel better. And yet for me, again, similar to the breath, it seemed again like a huge missed opportunity, because what I was noticing was that the way that I was approaching the cold and the way that I was observing other people approach the cold was that there's a distinct difference in the ways that we can approach it. And so we can approach it and we can be very much in that kind of controlling, like, I'm gonna be stronger than it. I'm gonna get through this. I'm gonna push through it. And to me, that didn't really seem like the way to unlock the greatest benefits in it. And so very quickly for me, it became a practice of actually, how much can I surrender to this experience? How much can I surrender to this intense discomfort and the intense sensations that are arising within my body? And started to recognize what an incredibly powerful tool that was and how I could apply that in other situations in my life. And to give an example, at that time I was working as a paramedic. And so I was working on call, and, we would get a call at 3:00 in the morning, and that might be for a code 3 cardiac arrest or something like that. And so you wake up in the middle of the night, your pager's going off, you're getting this page and this message of what you're going to. And of course, your nervous system immediately is in fight or flight. Mm-hmm. And so what I recognized when that was happening is I would start to imagine what I would do if I was sitting down in the cold water, and how I would, again, create that relationship with the nervous system. And so I would wake up in the middle of the night and I would just visualize, that sitting down, those intense sensations, and really embracing and surrendering to what I was feeling, as opposed to being in resistance to it, which is, often and historically kind of the way that we've met stress is just, I'm going to push through it. I'm going to be in resistance to it. I'm going to overpower it, overcome it. And I think through the experiences that I'd had in my own life, I'd gotten to a place where I recognized that I just really needed to surrender to life And so for me, with cold exposure, that's been a huge part of the practice. And that's a huge part of the way that I teach it, is as a tool to be able to better navigate and develop a deeper relationship again with our body, with the sensations that present, with big emotions, and to be able to take that out into the rest of our life. And I often
Yeah.
say that life is the ice bath. And so we're going to have these moments where we're overcome with emotion and
Yeah.
stress and sensation. And so if we can cultivate a regular practice of being in relationship and surrendering to all of those, bringing ourselves into the present moment by connecting to our breath, then we become incredibly powerful at unwinding these old patterns, healing old traumas. And an interesting thing that I found about the cold was it was this intense stressor. And it was a super intense experience, but because of the way that it affects the chemistry of our body, after you do that experience, you feel really good because you get this huge rush of dopamine. You get this huge rush of endogenous painkillers, endorphins in your body. And so it starts to create this relationship or connection in between doing hard things and feeling really good. And so it becomes very motivating to meet these challenging circumstances. It's like, oh, okay, well, I know actually that on the other side of this, I'm going to feel really good.
Yeah.
And in the moment, it might feel really intense, but I've cultivated a practice of being in that intensity. And that I know that when I work through that, it's going to take me to a place that actually feels really good. And so it starts to rewire the brain in that way.
Mhm. Yeah, it's like a
Mm-hmm.
reward system for doing the hard thing, right? Yeah, it's interesting because there's so many parallels, I think, in just even my own journey of like accepting the full spectrum of human emotion. I'm a deeply feeling person. Like I have a lot of water in my chart. And yeah, being raised in like an Eastern European, very like matter of fact, non-emotional family, it's been challenging to like rewire that for myself. And I think, especially over this past year, I've been brought through like some very intense experiences of grief, right? Left behind a whole other life. And I think that exactly what you're saying, it's such a parallel to life, like understanding that like if we don't feel if we don't allow ourselves to actually be present and experience those like lows or those challenging moments, then we also can't get the rewarding high moments, right? We can't experience the like love and the connection and the peace and like all the things that we seek if we don't experience the grief or the sadness or in this case the cold.
Absolutely. Well, and I feel like, I'm guessing that most of the people listening to your podcast are very aware of this transition that we're
Mhm.
in right now, and probably recognizing that we're transitioning into something that's unknown. We know that there's this incredible transformation occurring, but
Mhm.
we don't know exactly where it's leading, what it's going to look like. We've never experienced this before. And I think in our culture, we have had an intense fear of the unknown. And we could link that to the feminine and to the mystery of life and all of these different aspects. But there's almost been a banishment of that and an attempt to control every aspect of life. And so with that fear of the unknown, for me, again, kind of circling back to where we started with cold, being able to meet something that I'm deeply fearful of, even at this point, practicing cold exposure for the better part of 10 years on a fairly regular basis, there's still a part of me that doesn't want to get in the cold. That's still scared of getting in the cold every time I get in. And so again, it's a practice of meeting fear.
Mhm.
And even though it's a known stressor, we can utilize what we learn from that practice to be able to meet our fear of the unknown of what's unfolding right now,
Yeah.
and to be able to have a direct experience of what meeting those fears feels like, how to work through them, how to come into that place of surrender, how to develop that internal sense of safety, and just trust that this transition that we're all going through is something wild and amazing and incredible, and we don't need to know what it looks like, and just develop that sense of trust that on the other side of it all, that we're going to wake up to something beyond our wildest dreams.
Mm-hmm. Totally. It's funny because I also have a deep resistance to cold. And I really can only like run into the cold if there's like a sauna nearby, and then I know that I'm just going to be safe in that sauna after. But it's interesting that I ended up in Revelstoke too, from a personal perspective, because I do think that it is part of my journey of conquering that fear. Like I've been learning to downhill ski, as you know, and I think the fear is like a big part of that. And it's interesting that you brought up like the conditioning around like our stories around the cold, because I think I've seen the direct result of like every time I have a fall or something like that. Like I'm doing really well, I'm like super confident, right? And then I fall, and then immediately after that I'm programmed to think like, okay, well now I'm like scared of this steep slope, right? So it's been really interesting to just notice how much fear is just like this barrier, this that feeds into like a certain belief, right? And how it can really show up in seemingly, you know, routine daily tasks or things that you're learning to take on, but also on a broader scale of how it shows up in our life, right? When we're trying to take a step into the unknown, or we're trying to do something that we're really afraid of. Yeah, I think it's so powerful to have these tools that are able to like rewire those beliefs, right? And unlearn.
Yeah, well, there's a line of teachings that I've been following, and maybe some of your listeners might be familiar with them. They're the channelings of Paul Selig, and he channels a group of beings called the Guides,
Oh, okay.
and they speak a lot to, you know, to the polarity of love and fear, and they always say that the action of fear is to create more fear. And so you know, if we can start to have that awareness of the way that fear works in our lives, and that when fear presents, that's what it does, is it creates more fear, it builds, it's, you know, it's contagious. And so again, if we start to develop a deeper relationship, our own personal relationship with fear, and start to see that arise within our experience, and then be able to cut it off before it starts to build and gain more momentum, then that can really have a powerful effect in the way that we're living in the world.
Yeah, I love that. Well, I'm just noticing the time. We just have a few more minutes left. So I'd love to just open up the floor to you to share anything else you might want to. How can people work with you? Where can they find you? What's upcoming? Whatever comes to mind for you, or even just any last words of wisdom.
Yeah, thank you. Well, people can work with me in many different ways, and I work one-on-one with people. I also offer online courses, and I do a hybrid in-person and online 1-year facilitator training for breathwork and cold exposure. And really that the breathwork and the cold exposure are almost secondary to coming in and stepping into our own leadership in our life. So that's a huge initiation in really stepping up, meeting our fears, and really becoming a leader in our own lives and within our communities as well. So people can work with me in all of those ways. They can find more information on the website, breatharmy.com. I'm fairly active on Instagram as well. Always love it if people reach out and send messages. I'm super responsive to those. So there's some free offerings that I have. One is a offering that happens every Sunday morning at 9 a.m. Pacific time, and that's called the Breath Temple. And so that's an opportunity to come in and explore some of these different modalities of breath work, and I like to weave them together in creative ways. And so the Breath Temple is actually almost at its 5-year anniversary. So we celebrate 5 years in March. So that's exciting. That's free. Again, people can sign up on the website. If people are interested in diving deeper with the breath, learning more about it, I've got a really amazing free mini course online that's called The Foundations of Breath. And that speaks more to this idea of the relationship between the breath and the nervous system, body, emotions, and some of the practices that I would call functional breathing practices. There's some big breathing practices in there. And so it's called a mini course, but there's actually a lot in that course. Again, people can get that on the website, and it's free. I'm feeling a new course being birthed through me at this time. And so I'm excited to share more about that as it becomes kind of more clear in my own field. And I would say that that'll be coming up over the next couple of months. And so if people sign up for any of those offerings, then they'll be added to the newsletter and get updates on all of the things that I'm doing. And even though I'm stationary here in Revelstoke over the winter, that I'll be out traveling around in the world again here come spring. So yeah, people are on the newsletter, then they'll be able to see where I'm going to be and what I'm offering in the world.
Awesome. Lots of exciting things and ways to connect with you. So thank you for that. And I will link everything in the show notes as well, so folks can find these things easily. Yeah, thank you so much, Jeff. This has been lovely chatting with you and learning from you, and yeah, just getting to know your journey a little bit as well. So thanks so much for your time, and thank you everyone for listening.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Vanya. It's been a real pleasure. And thanks to everybody for listening.
Awesome. See you next time, everyone.